Joyce Bellamy noticed, somewhere in her second year of retirement, that she had started feeling a small knot of dread every time her phone lit up with one of her children's names. Not joy, not the easy warmth she used to feel, something closer to bracing herself. This is the story of how she finally named that feeling and what she did about it. This is her story. Joyce was 70 years old, a retired high school English teacher who had spent 33 years in the same small Georgia town, widowed for 7 years since her husband Walter passed from a sudden stroke. She lived on a modest but genuinely sufficient pension in the same house where she'd raised her 2 children, Marcus, now 45, and Tiffany, now 38. She had 3 grandchildren she loved fiercely and saw, in practice, only a handful of times a year: birthdays, occasional holidays, the rare, hastily arranged visit. Joyce had spent her entire career teaching teenagers to examine texts closely, to notice patterns in language and behavior that revealed more than any single sentence could on its own. It was a particular kind of irony, she would later reflect, that it took her the better part of 2 years to apply that same careful attention to the pattern quietly forming inside her own family, a pattern she might have spotted immediately in someone else's story had she been reading it in a novel rather than living it herself. She missed Walter most, she often thought, during the ordinary evenings when she might have simply told him about a call from one of the children, and he would have said something dry and clear-eyed that helped her see the situation plainly, the way he always had during their 39 years of marriage. Without him, she found herself working through these realizations more slowly, more privately, second-guessing her own instincts in a way she rarely had to when he was still there to talk things through with her. This is not a story about one dramatic financial betrayal, one large sum lost, all at once. It is a quieter, more corrosive kind of story, the kind that so many parents recognize immediately and rarely discuss out loud, even with their closest friends. It is the story of a pattern repeated so many times over 2 years that it eventually became impossible for Joyce to ignore. The pattern always followed roughly the same shape. It began, almost without exception, with genuine warmth, a real conversation, real affection, real interest in Joyce's own life, and it ended almost without exception with a request for money. The first call Joyce remembers clearly, looking back, came on her own 68th birthday, nearly 2 years before the day she finally named the pattern to herself. Marcus called that morning, cheerful and warm, wishing her a happy birthday, asking about her plans for the day, telling her sincerely that he loved her. Joyce felt the particular glow that only a mother feels, hearing her son's voice sound genuinely happy to talk to her. They talked for nearly 15 minutes about nothing in particular. A movie he'd seen, a funny thing one of the grandchildren had said, an old memory from Joyce's own childhood that had come up in conversation. Joyce remembers hanging up the phone that day before the final request came, thinking about what a wonderful, easy conversation it had been, exactly the kind of call she used to imagine having regularly with her grown son once the busyness of his younger years settled down. She allowed herself, for those 15 minutes, the simple pleasure of feeling close to him, unaware that this particular call would later become, in her own memory, the first entry in a pattern she wouldn't fully recognize for nearly 2 more years. Then, in the final minute of the call, Marcus's tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Actually, Mom, I hate to even bring this up on your birthday, but my car's making this awful noise, and the mechanic says it's going to be around $600 to fix. I wouldn't ask, but I really need the car for work, and I just don't have it right now." Joyce sent the money that same afternoon, glad to help, telling herself it was simply what mothers did. The birthday call had felt wonderful. The request felt like a small, reasonable coda to an otherwise lovely conversation. She didn't think much more about it. The second call that stayed with Joyce came the following spring on Mother's Day. Tiffany called early that morning, before Joyce had even finished her coffee, her voice full of genuine affection. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom. I was just thinking about you and how much I appreciate everything you did for us growing up. I don't say that enough." Joyce felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the unexpected sincerity in her daughter's voice. They talked for a while about Tiffany's own children, about a school project Sophie, 9 years old, was working on, about how quickly the grandchildren seemed to be growing. Near the end of the call, Tiffany's voice shifted slightly, the same subtle key change Joyce would later come to recognize instantly. "Mom, I hate to ask, especially today of all days, but Sophie's swim team fees are due this week, and it's just a really tight month. Would there be any way you could help with that? It's only about $200. Joyce agreed immediately, moved by the image of her granddaughter missing out on something she loved over a relatively small amount of money. It seemed, at the time, like such a small, easy way to help. Individually, over the following months, each call followed roughly the same emotional architecture. Real warmth first, a specific financial need second, always reasonable sounding on its own, always framed apologetically, always accepted gladly by Joyce, who genuinely wanted to help her children and grandchildren however she could. It was nearly 18 months into this pattern, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, that Joyce finally sat down with her own bank statements and did something she realized, with some discomfort, she hadn't actually done in over a year. Looked honestly at the cumulative total, rather than simply approving each individual request as it arrived. The number surprised her considerably more than she expected it to. Car repairs, swim team fees, a late credit card payment for Marcus, school supplies and a dental bill for Tiffany's youngest, a security deposit when Marcus moved apartments unexpectedly. None of these requests, taken individually, had ever felt unreasonable in the moment. Added together, across 18 months, they amounted to a genuinely significant portion of the emergency reserve Joyce had carefully built during her working years, money she had always considered untouchable except for true emergencies of her own. She thought, sitting there with the statement spread out in front of her, about the specific lesson she used to teach every autumn to her sophomore English classes, how to recognize a pattern building slowly across a novel, one small detail accumulating quietly until, by the final chapters, the reader understood the full shape of something the characters themselves had been too close to see clearly. She had explained that lesson to teenagers for over 3 decades, She had never once expected to need it applied to her own bank statements in her own kitchen at 70 years old. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time that afternoon, the printed statement in front of her, feeling something complicated settle over her. Not quite anger, not quite regret, something closer to a slow, uncomfortable recognition of a shape she hadn't let herself see clearly until laid out in black and white. The pattern reached its sharpest point that December, during the holiday season Joyce would later describe to herself as the moment everything finally became impossible to explain away. Christmas morning came and went without a single call from either child, not unusual in itself since both had their own households and holiday traditions to manage. Joyce told herself she would hear from them in the following days once the initial rush of the holidays settled. Marcus called 2 days after Christmas, warm and affectionate as always, catching her up on the kids' presents before mentioning toward the end of the call that an unexpected car insurance bill had come due right in the middle of the holidays and asking if Joyce might be able to help cover it. Tiffany called the following day, equally warm at first, describing the chaos of the holiday with 2 young children, before eventually mentioning that the holiday season had left her a bit behind on the electric bill and asking apologetically if Joyce could help bridge the gap until her next paycheck. Joyce hung up the phone after that second call and sat very still in her quiet living room, surrounded by the last remnants of her own modest holiday decorations, doing an uncomfortable piece of math in her head. Throughout the entire holiday season, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, the days surrounding it, neither of her children had called simply to talk, simply to wish her a happy holiday without any accompanying request. Every single conversation, examined honestly, had eventually arrived at the same destination. She thought about Christmases from decades earlier, when Marcus and Tiffany were small, when the phone hadn't existed at all in the equation because they were simply there, underfoot, tearing wrapping paper, arguing over toys, filling the house with a chaos she used to complain about, and now quietly missed more than she let herself admit most days. She wondered when exactly the shift had happened. Not the physical distance, which was ordinary and expected as children grew into their own adult lives, but this other distance, this new pattern where even a phone call had come to mean something transactional, rather than simply a continuation of the closeness they'd once had without even trying. It was that particular realization, more than any single dollar amount, that finally broke something open in Joyce that had been quietly cracking for nearly 2 years. She called her longtime friend Helen a few days later, the two of them meeting for their usual Thursday coffee after church, and Joyce found herself for the first time describing the entire pattern out loud from the birthday call forward, watching Helen's face as she listened. "Joyce, my 2 call me at least once a week just to chat," Helen said gently when Joyce finished. "Sometimes we don't talk about anything important at all, just life. When was the last time that happened with either of yours?" Joyce sat with that question for a long moment, genuinely searching her memory, and found, with a small private ache, that she couldn't actually remember the last time either Marcus or Tiffany had called her, simply because they missed her voice, with no financial thread woven anywhere into the conversation. "I'm afraid Joyce admitted quietly that if I stop helping, I'll stop hearing from them altogether. At least right now, I know they call. She said it out loud for the first time in that quiet corner of the church coffee hour, and hearing the words leave her own mouth made the fear feel both more real and oddly more manageable than it had felt sitting privately in her chest for months. Helen reached across the table and took her hand. "Joyce, listen to what you just said. You're grateful they call because you're paying for the calls. In a sense, that's not a relationship. That's a transaction you've talked yourself into accepting because the alternative feels even lonelier." The words landed hard, and Joyce carried them home with her that afternoon, turning them over for days afterward, testing them against her own memory of every call over the past 2 years, unable to find a single honest exception to Helen's blunt assessment. Helen's own relationship with her 2 children offered Joyce a quiet, aching kind of contrast in the weeks that followed. Helen mentioned, almost in passing during their next coffee, that her son had called the previous evening simply to tell her about a documentary he'd watched. Nothing more, no request tucked into the final minute of the call. Her daughter had stopped by unannounced the week before just to drop off a jar of homemade jam, staying for 45 minutes of easy, meandering conversation before heading home. Joyce found herself genuinely happy for her friend and genuinely grieving in a small, private way for the version of her own family life she realized she hadn't experienced in longer than she wanted to admit. The turning point, when it finally arrived, wasn't dramatic. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, weeks after that conversation with Helen, when Joyce's phone lit up with Marcus's name on the screen, and she noticed with a small private shock the exact physical sensation that crossed her chest in that instant. Not warmth, not anticipation, but a quick, reflexive bracing, the same tightening she imagined a person might feel seeing an unexpected bill arrive in the mail. She let the phone ring twice before answering, using those few extra seconds to actually sit with the sensation rather than push past it the way she normally would have. She thought about Walter, about how he used to answer the phone from either of the children with an easy, uncomplicated smile spreading across his face before he'd even said hello. She realized, sitting there in her quiet kitchen, that her own face no longer did that automatically, and hadn't for longer than she wanted to admit to herself. She sat with that realization for a long moment before answering the phone, understanding with sudden and complete clarity that this was not the relationship she wanted to have with her own son for whatever years she had left. She did not want to spend her remaining time on earth flinching at the sound of her children's names. Joyce didn't confront Marcus in that particular call. Instead, she spent the following week thinking carefully, the way she used to prepare lesson plans decades earlier, about exactly what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, not from anger, not as a punishment, but as an honest, overdue clarification of what she actually needed from her relationships with both of her children. She called Marcus first on a quiet Sunday evening and asked him to really listen rather than simply wait for his turn to respond. "Marcus, I love you, and I have loved helping you and your sister whenever I could, but I need to tell you something honestly, because I don't think either of us has said it out loud before. I've noticed that almost every time we talk, the conversation ends with a request for money. I miss you. I want to hear your voice because you miss me too, not only when there's a bill to cover. There was a long silence on the line. Mom, I didn't realize it looked like that from your side, Marcus finally said, sounding genuinely taken aback. I mean, I do love talking to you. The money stuff just comes up because things have been hard. I understand that things have been hard, Joyce said gently, and I still want to help sometimes, when I can, and when it's something we've actually talked through together. But I need us to have calls and visits that have nothing to do with money at all. And I need to set an actual limit on what I can comfortably give, so it isn't left open-ended the way it has been. Marcus was quiet again for a moment, and Joyce could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, clearly working through something he hadn't expected to have to think about so directly. Can I ask you something, Mom? Are you doing okay financially? Is that what this is really about? I'm doing fine, Marcus, Joyce said honestly. This isn't about whether I can afford to help sometimes. It's about wanting our relationship to be about more than whether or not I can. She told him specifically and calmly the amount she was comfortable considering each month going forward, and made clear that anything beyond that would require an actual conversation about the full situation, not simply a quick request answered in the moment. The call with Tiffany a few days later followed a similar shape, though Tiffany's reaction carried more immediate emotion. Mom, are you saying you don't want to help Sophie with things anymore? Tiffany asked, her voice tightening with what sounded like real hurt. I'm not saying that at all, Joyce said carefully. I'm saying I want to choose when and how I help, rather than it being something I feel obligated to say yes to every single time out of fear that saying no means you'll stop calling. I want you to call me because you want to talk to your mother, not because you need something from her. Tiffany was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened considerably. I didn't think about it that way. I guess I have been reaching out mostly when things are tight. I'm sorry, Mom. That's not fair to you. I'm not angry with you, sweetheart, Joyce said. I just want us both to notice it now that we see it and choose something different going forward. I still want to help with Sophie's swim fees sometimes, and I still want to be part of the kids' lives in every way I can. I just don't want that to be the only reason my phone rings. It won't be, Tiffany said, her voice thick. I promise, Mom. The weeks immediately following those two conversations were not entirely comfortable. Marcus grew noticeably quieter for a stretch, calling less frequently than usual, and Joyce recognized with some private sadness the particular awkwardness of a habit being disrupted before a new one has had time to take its place. Tiffany, by contrast, called more openly in the days that followed, occasionally circling back to apologize again, working visibly to recalibrate the pattern she now saw clearly for the first time. But slowly, over the following months, something genuinely began to shift. Marcus called one Saturday afternoon simply to tell her about a fishing trip he'd taken with a friend. No request attached anywhere in the conversation, and Joyce found herself sitting on her back porch afterward, phone still warm in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in nearly 2 years, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of hearing from her son for no reason at all. Tiffany began sending occasional photos of the grandchildren throughout the week, small, unprompted updates that carried no request behind them whatsoever. Sophie's drawing from art class, a video of her youngest learning to ride a bike. Small things, but genuinely different in character from the calls that had defined the previous 2 years. Joyce still helped both of her children financially occasionally when a real need arose, and they discussed it honestly together within the limit she had clearly established. But the help now existed inside a relationship that had room for other things too, rather than serving as the relationship's entire foundation. 6 months after that first difficult conversation with Marcus, Joyce sat on her porch one evening with Helen, describing almost with disbelief an entire week that had passed with 3 separate calls from her children, none of them involving a single dollar. Helen simply smiled and squeezed her hand, the particular satisfaction of a friend who had watched someone she loved fight her way back to something she deserved all along. Joyce's story is worth telling because so many parents recognize this particular ache immediately, even when they've never said it out loud to anyone, even to themselves. It rarely announces itself as a single dramatic betrayal. It arrives slowly, one reasonable request at a time, until the parent finds themselves, quietly and without quite meaning to, associating their own children's phone calls with financial bracing rather than genuine joy. It is worth saying, too, that neither Marcus nor Tiffany were bad people, or even in any deliberate sense using their mother. Both of them were navigating genuine financial pressures of their own, and both of them, in their own way, did love Joyce deeply. The pattern formed not because either of them set out to exploit her generosity, but because a habit, once established and never questioned aloud, simply continues along its own momentum until someone finally interrupts it. Joyce came to understand that naming the pattern wasn't an act of accusation. It was, in its own way, an act of care for the relationship itself, rescuing it from a shape neither she nor her children had ever consciously chosen. If this pattern feels familiar, here is what Joyce's experience can teach us. Pay attention to patterns, not just individual moments. A single reasonable request for help is entirely different from a relationship consistently defined by money, and the difference only becomes visible when you look honestly at the whole picture rather than each incident alone. Review your own bank statements regularly and look closely at the cumulative total of small, individually reasonable transfers over time. What feels manageable, one request at a time, can add up to something genuinely significant across months or years. You can love your children fully and still refuse to let that love be measured or defined primarily by money. Those are not contradictory positions. They are, in fact, essential to each other. Establish a clear financial limit. How much? How often? Under what circumstances? And communicate it directly. Clear boundaries protect both your own security and the relationship itself, rather than threatening it. Ask directly for the kind of connection you actually want. Silence about this rarely resolves it on its own. Your children may genuinely not realize the patterns exists, until you name it clearly and specifically, and expect the shift to feel uncomfortable, even awkward, before it feels healthier. A period of quiet or hurt feelings or adjustment is not evidence that you made the wrong choice. It is simply what change looks like in its earliest and most unfamiliar stage. Joyce's phone still lights up regularly with her children's names, but these days, more often than not, she feels something closer to what she used to feel decades ago, hearing them call simply because they wanted to talk to their mother. That feeling, she has come to understand, was never something she should have had to fight this hard to get back, but it was always worth fighting for. She thinks sometimes about what she would tell her own students all those years ago about a character who finally recognizes a pattern that had been forming quietly around her the entire time. She would have told them that recognizing the pattern was never the end of the story. It was simply the moment the character finally had a real choice about what happened next. Joyce likes to think she made a good one. Do your children mostly call when they need something? How have you handled it? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else bracing right now at the sound of their own phone ringing might need to read your answer and might need to know they are not alone in feeling this particular, just quiet kind of ache. If Joyce's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity years, because being needed and being loved were never meant to feel like the exact same thing.